Good afternoon, and welcome to the afternoon panel session entitled, How Do We Sustain Investor Interest in Advanced Therapies for the Long Term? My name is Ren Benjamin. I'm a managing director and head of equity research at a small investment boutique called H.C. Wainwright, and I'll be the moderator of the session. Now, I fully understand that this is the last panel for the day, and that my esteemed panel and myself are the only one between all of you and a fine glass of Chardonnay. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the illustrative resumes of all the people that are here, but rather just give you a quick introduction. Starting to my left is Kevin Kinsella, founder of Avalon Ventures, a firm specialized in financing and development of over 100 early-stage companies, including Onyx and Vertex. Next to him is Dan Manicella, head of business development at the newly IPO'd Applied Genetics Technologies Corporation. He was previously at Merck KGaA and Morphosis. Next to him is Dennis Purcell, founder and senior advisor at Aisling Capital. Prior to Aisling, he was at Chase HQ, where he was involved in over 200 transactions, totaling in excess of $10 billion. And last but not least, Brock Reeve, executive director of the Harvard Stem Cell Institute, where he oversees operations and strategy for the Institute. And with that brief introduction, let me jump to my forward-looking statements. Now, you guys, should know that this is a very diverse panel that you see here, cross-section of the industry, and we'll be tackling several different topics, including what are the important factors to consider when investing in companies, such as the majority of the audience here. What are the issues and challenges that are that could come and unfold, and how do we fund our way through that, right? So we're looking at how we're going to fund this industry going into the future. And then, of course, talk a little bit about, are we there yet? And if we're not there yet, when are we going to get there? And make some predictions to some black swan events that may or may not occur. As this audience knows, oops, let me just go back one. The other things that we'll be talking about is many challenges, because obviously if you're talking about funding, you're talking about the challenges that we need to fund through. And so we'll be revisiting a lot of the things that were issued or talked about at this morning's plenary session, but this time from the point of view of investors. And then just as a warning to all of you that are here, a lot of you that are obviously executives in companies, a warning that there may be some opinions here that you should really take to heart, may be painful, and if you are susceptible to feeling pretty bad, I think we've opened up the bar for early drinks. You're welcome to partake in that. So, as this audience knows better than anyone else, the cell and gene therapy space has made tremendous progress over the years. From pharma acquisitions to Nobel Prize winners to marketing approvals, the space has seen it all. More importantly, the space has defined that the best years have yet to come. On top of that, investors seem to be getting behind the agenda and starting to fund the sector, and that funding continues to increase. But in my mind, the data can be misleading, misinterpreted, could be spun. I'm a sell-side analyst. I know how to spin data very well. And at least from a public perspective, I think that the underlying sentiment remains essentially a sentiment of caution, risk-off, as far as cell and gene therapy companies are concerned. And so with that, let me start off to the panel who sees a lot of these companies and who are, frankly, at the front end of investing, and ask you guys, is that underlying sentiment that I'm seeing from a public perspective of caution and risk-off, is that really true? Or do these graphs really show a bona fide interest in the space and what looks like, if you extrapolate this trajectory, funding in this space for the foreseeable future? Kevin, would you like to start us off?
Sure. From Avalon's perspective, and that's what I'll talk about, the thing we've always tried to avoid is investing in a science project. And let me use the example of a company that we're just making an investment in out of Stanford. So this is an eminent researcher who presented this morning, Jill Helms, who is an MD, Ph.D., and she's also a dentist as well. Just wanted to add another degree. So part of our process is first-class investigator, research that's meaningful and will tick a bunch of boxes off on what we're looking for there. Something that can be accomplished in terms of getting into the clinic within a reasonable period of time. And it really was, it's taken 3 years watching her work, her getting CERM grants and so forth, for me to feel comfortable that we sort of reached the tipping point where it was appropriate for venture capital to make an infusion of money which will accelerate things, which will be able to give her and her team access to equipment, to a way to rapidly get our product, which is stem cell growth factor, Win3A, produced in serum-free media, et cetera. And so I think we're pretty excited about where the company is positioned. But a lot of the things I've noticed over the years, you have to wait until the third or fourth coming of them. So I think we're probably at the fifth coming of nanotechnology now, maybe the fourth or fifth coming of gene therapy. Cell therapy is a little younger than that, but not necessarily much. But in any event, not to monopolize the conversation, if things come together at a point where we can hope to have a product in the clinic within a couple of years, I think we feel pretty good about making that investment.
So you're not as cautious, as, let's say, the public markets may be reflecting in various stock prices?
Well, venture capitalists who invest in startups on cocktail napkins can't be that cautious.
How about you, Dan? What are you seeing?
Well, I think from the gene therapy space, it seems pretty bullish, quite frankly. AGTC went public this year. We were able to do a follow-on 3 months later. A variety of other AAV gene therapy companies also went public. And, I mean, this is going to sound trite, but, I mean, at one point during late 2013 and beginning of 2014, it seemed like another AAV gene therapy company was sprung up every month that was VC-backed. So from our side, the graph looks like that's really what's going on. I realize that at times the markets got more selective, but I think, as I say, from the gene therapy space, particularly for AAV, or companies that had some pretty robust data, I think that the investors became pretty interested, not only biotech investors, but investors who were outside of biotech looking for return potentially down the road.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe follow up a little bit, Dan, on that. I guess I'm on the side of caution. We usually do our business plans on a sheet of paper, not a napkin. So maybe that's why Avalon's more successful. But, I don't put much emphasis into this slide. I mean, I think basically in the public markets, you really have three kinds of people that are driving deals. One are the insiders, the VCs. You're seeing more of that. They're investing on the deals. Then you have people that are around for good times and bad times, the T. Rowe Prices and Fidelities and the like. And then, and in my judgment at least, it's the people at the margin, the generalists, that are driving this right now. And they're driving it because it's momentum. I mean, they wouldn't know gene therapy if it hit them in the face, but they do know if the stock comes at 10 and goes to 13, they made some money. So as long as stocks are going up, stocks are going to go up, and we're going to attract those people. Now, what we've seen over a long period of time is that it's very cyclical, and once stocks stop going up, they're long gone, and then you're left simply with the VCs and the traditional kind of players. So I think, I'm going to get into this a little bit later. I listened to this morning, and it just struck me as if it was 20, 25 years ago in biotech, and I'll get into that later. But in terms of this, I think it's a momentum play by that third group that's just driving it, and it'll be good. It'll be good as long as it's good.
Brock,
can I quote you on that? It's going to be good as long as. I'd also sort of make an argument for a couple of other investor types. One is, I gather we're here in California, and the California voters are an investor in this whole space of regenerative medicine, right? I mean, they've put in, or will be putting in $3 billion over 10 years. And not only are those some science projects, but there's some active companies being brought to the market as a result of that. And so I think they have that investor class has a different perspective. Another investor class who my Harvard Stem Cell Institute hat on is private philanthropists and disease foundations who have funded a lot of our early stage work, some of which are science projects, but some are actually ready to move into the clinic and are ready for partnering with commercial entities. And again, they have many different motivations. Some because they want to fund early stage science that no one else is doing. Some because they want to have an impact on the disease area and it's personal to them. And others because they think this is the way to really move the needle in a way that you can't otherwise do and have a direct impact. So I wouldn't, so as we talk about investors, they're definitely an investor class that wouldn't show up in this graph. And they have a very long-term view. For example, I know out here, Viasite is about to go into phase 1 trial and has corporate funding, has investor funding, has CERM funding. We've also been working on the whole idea of turning embryonic stem cells or iPS cells into beta cells, and have done that all through private philanthropy, both foundation as well as individuals. So you can sort of, see that people are taking the long view, and I think ultimately are optimistic, but don't necessarily have to think about it purely in terms of financial returns as well.
And that's a good point. We'll touch back on that when we talk about funding through periods of drought, or when the news becomes negative or whatever's the case. Here's this group of investors that you can go to that take a much more longer view. So one of the all of you guys, from Dan to the venture guys, you all look at companies to invest in. Some from a business development point of view, others from a venture perspective, investing perspective. All of you in the audience, one of the things that you have in common is you're constantly looking for funding to move programs forward. And we wanted to, with this panel, try to get at least a checklist or some boxes that you could think about that need to be addressed, at least from the panel's perspective, that you must have, would be good to have when seeking investments. And so maybe we'll start off with Dan, who's on the business development side. Talk a little bit about what are the factors that are the most important for you when considering an investment. And for you said on both sides. One is trying to either sell an asset from your company or acquire an asset, and then we can go to the venture guys.
Right. So thanks. So I realize how dumb I am, because this guy can invest on a napkin, and this guy only needs a sheet of paper. I need a whole PowerPoint deck to do this. But anyway, So from the business development side, we're often trying to partner, and so we're either trying to acquire an asset or trying to sell an asset. And I guess AGTC particularly is in the orphan disease space. We like ophthalmology, we like lung diseases. So when we're out looking around, we're thinking about the regulatory pathway, most of all. So how hard is it going to be? Are the endpoints codified either at EMA or at the FDA? Because that pathway is really going to help us design our clinical trials. And as you know, many of these pathways aren't well developed, and we are just frankly too small to put the money in there to try to blaze that path forward. So we're really looking for places, and when we're looking for companies, that's one of our key aspects is what's that pathway going to look like. The other thing we're looking for, and maybe this is just particular to gene therapy, I doubt it though, we do a lot in ophthalmology. We find that the vectors that we use in mice work very nicely, and when we move up to dogs, they often don't work. And when we move up to NHPs, they definitely don't work because the eyes are completely different. And so we find that we're actually having to do a lot of work earlier in NHPs than we would go very quickly right after mice. And so we're now looking at companies and saying, so what is the more expensive animal model that you have, because there's some sense of what this product may do in the clinic if it's not there already. And so those have become two really important things to us that, not only are we touting to our investors that we do, but we're also looking for when we're looking at other companies.
Dennis?
Yeah, it has a lot. This sector has a lot of interesting characteristics. It's very high cost of goods sold. It's very costly to run the phase 3. There's a ton of risk to approval. It's not clear that anything will get reimbursed. The IP market's murky. Manufacturing's tough.
Is this monoclonal antibodies 25 years ago? Is that what we're talking?
Is this an infectious disease meeting, or is this? It's kind of simple. I mean, our job, we have two jobs really, right? To make investment and sell an investment. And I think that one of the things we have to think about here is when you get third-party capital, the day we make the investment, we're thinking about how are we going to get out of it. It doesn't have to be tomorrow, it doesn't have to be next year or whatever, but I think that generally, venture guys like to see as much, Kevin's a little bit earlier stage and takes a little bit more risk in order to get more return. Later stage guys, really kind of want to understand what the risks are we're taking, where's the dollar going to get us, is it a real inflection point, is there enough money around the table? I mean, you look at it, and it's on my mind because we just sold a company, Moderator, yesterday in the anti-infective space. And, generally, preclinical models are pretty good. And then it's a block and tackle, and you run the clinical trials, and you know how much they're going to cost, and you know if they work, it's going to get approved, et cetera, et cetera. But the number of risks has been minimized. So I think that as we think about this space, to the extent that we can minimize the uncertainty, and that's hard to do possibly at this stage in the game because it's still early. And again, I go back, this just reminds me of biotech 20, 25 years ago. Kevin, I don't know when I talk about whether you would agree with this, but I think that really kind of, and making sure, this is all hard, making sure there's enough dollars around the table. With a phase 3 cancer trial for AML, we can tell you pretty well within $5 million or $10 million what it's going to get us. And I think for here we just don't know, and because the regulatory issues are still somewhat evolving, I think it's really important to have these companies well funded right from the beginning, because if they're not, by the time progress gets made, somebody else is going to come in and kind of take all the value. So it's a tricky area right now. But a potentially huge payoff. So,
Brock?
The other thing, as we think about some of the cell and gene therapy approaches, I think there's also an intersection between the two, with a lot of the gene editing tools and how do you combine them for different solution sets. And then there are also the alternatives as you think about, to your point, Dennis, about the economics of, cell therapy. I think that's one of the reasons it's also driving people to look at things like some of the exosome discussion you heard earlier today from Reneron and Capricorn, and there are others in that thinking about that too. And or small and large molecules that can stimulate certain resident progenitor cell population, whatever, that can essentially have potentially the same effect that at first we were attributing to a cell therapy. So I think we need to think about all those alternatives, rather than just saying, okay, cell and gene therapy per se is the way to go. Because then they're not only clinical trade-offs, but they're economic trade-offs too.
But when you put on your investor hat,
and to that point, I suspect if we ask for a definition of regenerative medicine, we'd get 20 different answers from 20 different people. So I don't think we have a vocabulary yet that everybody understands, particularly Wall Street.
That's for sure. But do you use that, when you're sitting across from a company, do you have a checklist that says, well, it's low on the totem pole if you're a cell therapy, but if you're more of a biologic, if you're more of a peptide, based biologic, that's something that I'm more comfortable with? Or do you solely just follow the science? Yep. Because you brought up exosomes, you brought up a lot of different other things to learn.
So there's sort of on the science side, and then there's on the investor side. As you know, we're trying to right now set up a fund that would be to invest specifically in the regenerative medicine space. And there, I think it is science-driven. You have to look at all the business criteria, but I think it's science-driven and says what is the best solution, and then you have to look at what does that mean in terms of timing, trade-offs, et cetera, and is there a viable business model, and clear exit, the standard stuff. But I think we have to think sort of agnostically about the scientific platform and think about the trade-offs, because a lot of time when the PI and scientists jump into it, they do what they know how to do, right? I mean, there are a dozen companies in the eye space, some doing cell therapy, some cells and scaffolds, some doing various forms of gene therapy, et cetera, and some doing small molecules, some doing combinations. So there are multiple approaches, and you'd have to think about what those trade-offs are and for which indications. But I think it has to be science-driven, and then you can go from there.
So so it's the same question. What are the boxes that you check off? But I'll take it from a different angle.
Yeah.
What if you saw them? If you saw a particular characteristic in front of you, would you not invest in it all? Might be too hard a question to answer.
No, it's not. I mean, if you, from the stage that we invest, so if we read an interesting paper in Science, Nature, PNAS, J Biochem, whatever, till you actually, and let's say it's a great new novel target or target pathway, and you decide, well, this is really going to be significant. Before you would have a product from that novel pathway, it would be 12 to 14 years. So the first decision you have to make is venture funds are 10 years long, so your fund will not survive long to see an exit. FIPCOs are not getting done anymore. So you need to figure out how you and the company are going to get to at least an inflection point of value, or at least the investor does, so that you can take a profitable exit between then and when there's a, to use a common metaphor, of a little green or blue pill that is sold for $10 a piece and costs, a fraction of a cent to make. Because we're not going to be around for that payoff. So there has to be some intermediate payoffs. And so to echo what Dennis said, and Brock as well, the critical risk, unlike when I got started in the business, which was more of a technical risk because there was sort of plenty of money around, the critical risk is financing risk. And so if you can't see your way through to having a company financed through this inflection point of value, that is not a prudent investment to make, because I can tell you that there are not friendly hands from the pharma industry that's going to reach across the chasm to get you to the other side when the bridge you're building only gets halfway across the chasm. I'll just tell the story that what I refer to as the golden age of venture investing in biotech was probably the 80s through the early 90s, when, as I like to say, you could start a company around an idea, around, I saw a cover about Alzheimer's disease on Newsweek, and I'm going to start a company. And I actually did. It was called Athena Neurosciences. And, rounded up, great science advisory board and so forth. And, a few $1 million. And then after you've plugged in all the equipment, you go out and raise more money at a courtesy markup of, 50% or 2x. And then, you get a couple of deals going with pharma, and you can either be acquired or go public. And your molecule, if you even have a molecule, has never even seen the inside of a rodent. Okay, that was the golden age of biotech investing, right? And I don't think it's coming back, but there's certainly, you see froth from here and there. So from our perspective, we've got to see fairly near-term progress that's going to interest a corporate partner. At the beginning, you want to have enough deep pockets around the table that can finance you through any stubbings of the toe that you will encounter, and you will encounter them. And sort of hope for the best. But the nice thing about being in the business today is that after the pharma companies have decimated their internal research, I mean, their whole campuses are sort of vacant with bats flying about in them, and they just have no products. And so you're seeing a lot of fantastic exits that Dennis's firm was recently participant of, from an entrepreneur that we had backed earlier. Unfortunately, not these two deals, but in an earlier situation. And I think you're going to see more of that. It's part of what was behind the deal that Avalon has with Glaxo, the $500 million deal where we thought we reset the rheostat as to risk and reward. So I think there are great opportunities there, but you really need to sort of figure it out. It's not just, let's throw in some money and see what happens. I think that's suicide.
So you, sure.
Yeah. Can I follow up on Kevin for a second? This morning as I was sitting here, I thought to myself, and Kevin, I don't think you were here this morning, but I thought to myself, this was like 25 years ago in the biotech sector, and I think there's some lessons learned. Like what I heard this morning was, we have one good result, the whole industry, the whole sector goes up. We have one bad result, the whole sector goes down. That used to be biotech. Kevin talked about the cover of Newsweek, beginning of biotech were science projects, or these science projects, beginning of biotech, were generally binary events. You know, if you were wrong, you lost it, and if you were right, you won it. Beginning of biotech, everybody rushed into phase 3 to try to show progress. We heard this morning about the risks of taking phase 2 and going into phase 3 too quickly. At the beginning of biotech, nobody knew what biotech was. So what did you do in terms of valuation? You relied on corporate partnerships. And if it's good enough for Glaxo, it must be good enough for Wall Street, and that was a prerequisite for going public. And if you look at that chart right there, the one that was up, the funding chart, you know, I think in the last 2 years, about 90% of the funding from the industries come from, forgetting about some of the foundations and stuff like that, is coming from corporate partnerships. So I think that the biotech industry, and then the biotech industry morphed, where the big pharma, Kevin talked about this a second, it morphed from big pharma is our validation and therefore we can go public, to the hell with big pharma, where we're going to become FIPGOs, or fully integrated. So then all of a sudden that became the new buzzword after the golden age in the 90s and the like. So I think that the biotech industry provides a great example for this sector in terms of growing pains, mistakes that were made, learnings to be had, and the like. And it just reminds me that a bunch of new entrepreneurs, a bunch of exciting science, a bunch of people that are very excited about it. And you know, it took us a while on the biotech side to get where we are, and it's going to take a little bit of time here, but hopefully some of the lessons that we learned over the last 15 or 20 years in biotech, we don't have to repeat here. But the similarity, when I sat there this morning, the similarities were striking to me. I felt like I could have been 1990 listening to the beginning of biotech almost.
So, I mean, I can, you know, from a public perspective, I can kind of echo, you know, what we're seeing quite a bit now, right? So by the time the companies are getting public, and we've gone through, you know, quite an IPO window, arguments. I mean, preclinical companies going IPO. There have been some talk about how this is once again going back to the golden age. But I know that investors, public investors we talk to, really focus on a couple of things. One is randomized clinical trial results. They've gone through the golden age and gone through the depths of sort of despair as phase 3 trials continued to fail because it was based on phase 2 trials that were single-armed studies with historical controls. I think, you know, one of the take-homes, and you guys, you know, can jump in and tell me if I'm wrong, but one of the take-homes should be that the sort of era of historical controls, as beautiful as it is, and definitely might provide a proof of concept for the company, from a public investor point of view, you know, just really isn't there anymore. And that's a significant amount of risk that they can't seem to get over, unless, of course, they have a short-term exit. If you're public, you have data that's coming out, they'll never see the light of day of this phase 3 trial, and they can get out, of course, they'll fund the company. But that's definitely one of the boxes that we like to check, at least on the public side, is dealing with more randomized data. So the environment, as you guys said, is considerably different. The IPO window has opened up significantly for the cell and gene therapy space, and cell and gene therapy is no longer a four-letter word. But that said, all the people in the audience, and it's tough to realize this now until it happens, should know that there are issues and challenges that are going to be unfolding. And you guys have a unique perspective because you've seen it happen before. What issues could be unfolding over the next several years in the cell and gene therapy space, even if you draw the parallel, you know, with biotech, that companies and investors should be thinking about now? And I brought up one thing about historically controlled data and bringing that in front of investors and trying to prove that this is how it'll work in phase 3. What else should we, you know, are things that could derail this entire process? Dennis, we'll start with you.
I think we have to define what the milestones are. Like Kevin said, you know, 10-year funds, 14-year companies. I mean, some of the companies this morning were 20 years plus to get to where they are today. So we don't have time as an investor to wait. CalPERS doesn't have time to wait for that, and you know, our funds don't last that long. So I think, I mean, like Kevin said, what are the milestones? And I think there's another thing we can learn from in biotech. Early days, I remember back at the JP Morgan conference back when people would get up and say they filed, and I remember a company called Alchemies in Boston, filed an IND filed an IND, and their stock was up 17 points over lunch. I remember Craig Venter at Solera right before lunch. I didn't say a word except, well, we filed a patent on something, and filed a patent. And we came back from lunch. Solera's stock was up like 55 points. So that were the milestones back then. Now the bar, at least in the in the biotech side, the milestones keep getting moved even further. So that it used to be, get some good phase 2 data, get a filing with the FDA, and now you can't win in the biotech. Everybody's paying attention to what's the sales uptake. So I think one of the things we have to do here, because it is early, we have to be very careful about the milestones and whether they're real or not and what the promise is. Because if we don't, we have a chance to stub our toe and people stop being interested in the sector. So I think we have to be just very measured about what we're trying to do, what the milestones are. Are they real milestones? Understand that when we make an investment, we have to get out of the investment at some stage, whether it's Wall Street or venture capital. Understand that most of us aren't like disease foundations or the Harvard Stem Cell Institute with longer time frames. Some of us have shorter time frames just by the nature of our business. And I think that we have to be extraordinarily careful about bad press here. I think that some rogue person that goes out and does something that puts a taint over the whole sector, could really put a chill on it for years. So I think that we have to learn back, we have to, again, go back to the biotech days, figure out what they had to figure out, and see if we can learn from it.
Brock, do you?
So related to that, I think two things, and also to your comment about controlled trials.
Yeah.
One of the things, particularly in the cell therapy space, that I think the industry runs, or collective industry runs the risk of, is the very early stage sort of anecdotal trials where you're doing a therapy in a handful of people. And, all of a sudden the press gets wind of, someone with macular degeneration all of a sudden self-reports that they can see better, right? Because patients now are, starting to share what's happening, right? So we don't know what's that the result of therapy, So understanding what caused that individual sense of their own improvement. And, and we've had cases where, that's happened in I think in various therapeutic areas. Related to that, I think we also have to think about what the regulatory approval process is going to be, particularly in the cell therapy space. Just because areas like the eye are easier, obviously. You may disagree, but just if you look at systemic infusion, you look at all the homing, safety, and engraftment issues that the FDA, to their credit, worries about and should worry about. Because cells aren't being processed the way drugs are, right? They're not being metabolized and all that sort of stuff. So all that stuff, and, we don't have the technology now to prove that we know where a cell goes, how long it stays there, and what it turns into or not, right? We can do that for mice, but it's hard to do that in vivo for people. And so understanding the implications of that to the timeline that Dennis was just talking about, I think is going to be huge and will affect particularly the cell therapy part of this business.
Kevin? If you look out, over the next 5 years, I mean, you're invested in a lot of these players. You know that there's phase 3 data that's coming out from probably 5 different companies over the next 2 years that could put a damper on the space. The phase 3 trial data is I'm going to call it a milestone that could adversely affect the space. Anything else?
They're the usual risks, but I think toxicity is one of them. There's a product that is out on the market called bone morphogenic protein 2, which was recently black boxed by the FDA because there was an unusual increase of cancer risk in patients who were using that. Part of the problem was that it was, after 7 days, it continued to be mitotic, and the other problem was that the cells migrated once they were put in place to begin with. So you need to be enormously careful about toxicities regarding any product you're going to put in humans. The other thing is you have to get your arms around manufacturing costs, which is one of the things Dennis mentioned earlier. Because if you can't do that, given reimbursement pressures, if you're solving a huge problem, then the reimbursement pressures ease off a bit. But there's a lot of continuing, which I expect there should be reimbursement pressures for very expensive drugs. So you need to be worried about that. If you're a founder of a company, you need to be concerned about whether you'll be able to raise money to continue what you're doing at reasonable prices into the future, so you just don't get completely diluted to oblivion along with your early investors. Yeah. So there are all of these sort of dangers along the way, but that's the business that many people, if not all the people sitting on the panel, are in. It's just what stage they're in and what they perceive to be the risk-reward ratio for each step along the way.
Dan, you're in a pretty unique position because you have to look at the competitive landscape, the other players that are in the similar indications, because how their trials go affect you and your company.
So, I mean, I think the bigger picture of, stuff happens, as they say, and there's going to be a
I didn't hear it that way, but that's
at the bar we can say how we want to hear how you heard it. But anyway, so I mean, there's obviously going to be failures. There's going to be, there could be a black swan event, but let's say barring the black swan event, just normal failures and issues that occur. I mean, my opinion is that good companies that have good science and have a well-defined plan and some endpoints are still going to get funded. They may be fewer and farther between when things get tough, but they're still going to get some funding. And so, one thing that I've seen is that companies tend to not define their space as well as they could. And it goes back to Dennis's comment. So what is the definition of regenerative medicine? What is gene therapy? What is cell therapy? There's a bunch of definitions in every one of those topics, right? So when an event occurs and there's a failure in phase 2B or a failure in phase 3, you need to have educated your investors so that they know exactly what space you're in and whether, in fact, that makes any difference that there was that failure over here or not, because it may not affect anything that you're currently doing. And you've got to continue that because investors are out there with 15 companies in their portfolio, and they're trying to keep up with a variety of different things that are going on, and they're not going to be an expert on every bit of science or who the new competitor is on every one of them the same way you are. So it's your job to continue to do that. And, I mean, as the BD guy, I can tell you, every time there's a deal, when I was in a venture-backed company, what a great deal, what are we doing today? And then you have to go through the re-education process of, well, we don't do that. We do this. And that's not hot today, or that is hot, but, that's a different kind of a deal. Or that's not a very good deal for these reasons, and we're over here, right? And, you're on the hot seat. So that CEO, BD person education process, I think, is really, really key because you've got to define your space. We are an AAV gene therapy company. We don't do what Bluebird does. We don't do gene therapy on stem cells, right? We are not an adenovirus company. We do not use lentivirus like Oxford Biomedica. So we have to define our space in what sounds like gene therapy. Well, there's a whole bunch of companies. What do they do? Right? And I think that really can help you in the long run in terms of nuancing your space. What are the defining points along the way in which you're either going to raise money or you're going to have an inflection point that's going to give you a higher valuation? And then ultimately, as both the gentleman next to me said, is what's the exit plan?
Dan, you're the public company here.
Well, we are now, but I've been in the other side.
No, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is they don't have a clue. 10 is they're unbelievably sophisticated. Where do you put your Wall Street investors in that continuum?
So that's a hard question, as you know. Can we just go back to the bar?
Just a number.
I think. So there's no answer. What I would say is that some of the analysts are really, really good, and they're probably 10s. And then I'd say there's some investors there who don't have a clue. They invested because they always invest when company A invests, and so they jumped in. Or they like that particular analyst, and they know that analyst is good, and so that analyst wrote a nice piece, they're in. So I would say that the venture capitalists tend to be more sophisticated and closer to the science than your Wall Street investors, but there is still a bit of a herd mentality. We also all know that VCs tend to invest sometimes because they like VC over here, or that company definitely has a good track record in a certain space, and they also will move with that too.
So here's a free-for-all
So I didn't
issue.
exactly answer your question.
Close enough.
Here's a free-for-all issue for the panel, right? Because one of the things that we had discussed was reimbursement. I mean, there was a payers panel. Reimbursement seems to be the buzzword. Sovaldi was being challenged, and there was a shot across the bow. Gilead fell to $60 and now is at $106 because somehow investors have gotten over it. How much is reimbursement? I mean, I know we put a lot of thought into it right now, but how much is it really an issue right now or even in the next 5 years? Because we had a panel a month ago at our conference where we had a guy from Aetna who essentially said, if it's on the NCCN guidelines, this is an oncology drug, but over $100,000, we're reimbursing it. There's not, we're not even thinking about it. So is it just an issue that's being created that's way far down the line that we don't have to worry about, or are you guys worried about it, and should companies be worried about it? That's for anybody.
Well, it's certainly a worry. I mean, in the gene therapy space, we have a drug that's been approved in the Western world. Unicure has a drug. We're still waiting for them to launch it, and so we don't know what the story is. Is it bad data? Is it reimbursement issues, or what? So there's a question, right, on the gene therapy industry side. What's going on there? On the other hand, we have it's something that's approved, which is also a real positive. So you have a little bit of a yin and yang there. The panel earlier today said, well, we want to pay for things over time because that's how we're used to doing it. If you're sitting on the company side, so think about you're trying to have a business plan, you're trying to think about an exit, and your assumption is I'm going to get paid X amount of money for a single injection that's going to last 10 years, a lifetime, pick whatever number you think it's going to be, and we'll see what the data points out. But so you're thinking you're going to get paid once. Well, your peak sales curve looks one way, and if you're now going to get paid over 10 years, well, that's a completely different peak sales curve. And it asks you then to think about, well, what's the price? Because if I thought I was going to charge X and get paid today, well, maybe I need to charge like 2X or plus 40% or whatever because there's time value of money, right? Because your curve just got shifted like this. So you went from here to way out here. So what exactly does that mean for your investors? And the story you've told whoever's investing in you, public or private. Or if you're trying to buy a company or you're trying to do a deal with a pharma company and you now think you're going to get paid way over time, it's a completely different ballgame. And I think that is going to be an issue that we're going to have to resolve, and it's probably with payers. And I hear funny things like we'll need writers. You guys are going to have to come up with pricing models and financial models to help us along. It kind of reminds me of going back to the 90s when managed care came in and everybody was risk sharing. No one knew what it meant, but we were all risk sharing, doing something. So, I don't know how it's going to play out. We're putting 3 programs into the clinic next year. We're really starting to think a lot about it, but it is certainly an open issue.
So, and on that, I mean, there just was that article in the paper yesterday about, the cancer immunotherapies and saying, look, you got an autologous cell therapy that costs $500,000. And is this a scalable business model, right? And if you can't scale it, then where does it go?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So everyone should be worrying about that even now.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. One of the key aspects.
I'll take the opposite side of that argument right now.
I was going to, but I'm happy that you.
I mean, for 95% of our companies, this is crucial. I mean, whether this cancer drugs are going to get approved or not, whether this anti-infective will be used in the hospital. I'm kind of more interested here in figuring out what the industry is going to look like. How are we going to define regenerative medicine? How are we going to get products that are going to get approved? And I think, a little bit of walk before we run. So for us making an investment here, yes, reimbursement's important, but I'd like to see this sector just really evolve and become a legit sector. And I'm more worried about that right now than I am about reimbursement. But most of our other companies are reimbursements.
I'll echo that sentiment, at least from a sell-side perspective. Our models assume kind of the going price for a lot of therapies right now. And I was asked something at dinner last night, like, oh, how do you try to factor in what could be reimbursement challenges? We don't factor it in. I mean, for the most part, there hasn't been any reimbursement challenges right now at these prices, at least not in the oncology space, and it depends, of course, on the therapeutic benefit. But we're looking at models 5 years down the line, and for us to start putting in different factors as to what the reimbursement landscape could look like 5 years down the line is a virtual impossibility. And so we take the prices that we're seeing right now that are being reimbursed hand over fist and apply that to our models and move forward. And that's at least what's involved when we're looking at investment decisions right now. So, I mean, moving on, one of the key aspects to advancing this class of therapies is to ensure investors like yourselves, right, that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And much like monoclonal antibodies, because everyone likes to go back to biotech 25 years ago or the monoclonal antibodies space when in its early days, a success or two, really does kind of usher in a new era of excitement. And I guess the question to the investors and Dan at the company is, are we there yet? Because you had brought up Unicure. The fact is, it got a marketing approval. Why hasn't that been enough for investors to kind of say, hey, look, the cell and gene therapy space is here and it's here for good? How do we, and if it's not now, right, when do we see that time coming? Because we do see what are the companies that are in phase 3 trials. We do know when that data is going to be coming out. Is it, do we see this inflection point happening in the next 5 years? And there was one other member who was supposed to be on the panel, and this is, I won't tell you his name, but he's with another venture fund. And he had pretty much, made the blanket statement of he doesn't think cell therapies like the way we're developing it now, will be approved in the next 3 to 5 years. And so he looked at, sort of the phase 3 trials that are ongoing right now, and frankly just doesn't think any of them are going to work. And so he's, thinking about this space as, really kind of hitting that inflection point 5 years from now, not now. But I'd love to hear, Brock, maybe what your thoughts are on where we are.
That sounded more like a Dan question.
You can punt it back to Dan if you want.
But I do think as we hit phase 3 trials, I think there will be a lot of surprises as you enter larger populations with greater genetic diversity than you've encountered in the small phase 1 and 2. And I do think that that'll to your comment about the other panelists' perspective, I do think that'll have a negative effect and push things out. But it also raises the argument for doing the controlled studies earlier. It also raises the argument for looking at comparators early. I know on this early stage science side, we typically aren't looking at, well, how is this going to, for example, in Parkinson's, how does cell therapy play against deep brain stimulation, against levodopa, against, whatever. And sort of look at, what would the sort of solution set in the clinic be, and how do you sort of think about that? Because that ultimately is going to be what impacts success.
Kevin?
I think part of what you have to do is you have to distinguish what you're covering with the umbrella of regenerative medicine. And because I think that gene therapy, antisense, et cetera, is very different from cell therapy. Because cell therapy doesn't involve, depending on how you use it, a lot of the potential risks that you get in gene therapy, where you have to have a potentially immunogenic vector that's delivering it. You don't know exactly where it's going to integrate. You don't know whether you want it to integrate or what the long-term consequences are there. Is it going to integrate in the germline, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas cell therapy is something that's just applied, to a wound or bone healing or spinal fusion or something like that. So I think you have to bifurcate among the various regenerative medicines what you're talking about, because they each have a set of risks and rewards to them.
Dan?
I think that's a good point. I mean, they are very different therapies, and even within, as I said earlier, within gene therapy, there's very different situations and very different vectors, and those vectors have, some have better side effect profiles than others. But, do we look like the antibody space 20 or 25 years ago? I don't really know if we do or not. What I think is that there's been some success in the gene therapy space. There's been some success in the cell therapy space. There'll be some failures. We've got, I think, a long way to go before we really know how this one's going to play out and whether we've gotten any green lights out here right now. I think we've gotten a lot of lights that say, hey, it looks interesting. We understand some of the science. We're moving forward in a nice, robust fashion, and people are differentiating in the space, whether it's in gene therapy or cell therapy, kind of the same way they did with monoclonal antibodies. But I think it's still pretty early days, frankly.
So, Dennis, let's say we hit a Jesse Gelsinger sort of event or a Black Swan event, or even doesn't have to be Black Swan. We see multiple phase 3 trials that are coming down the pipe, and the phase 3 trials fail for one reason or the other. And I can tell you from the public market side, investors run to the hills, until they can start to see what sort of new milestones they might be able to invest, for, right, to potentially drive shareholder value. The question is, who will be keeping the funding in place, or where do companies go at that point? Even if Dan, who's in gene therapy, somehow got swept under the rug with everybody else in the regen med space, where do you get funding from at that time?
Well, I mean, going back to the biotech analogy again, go back to sepsis back in 15, 18 years ago. With Synergen and Centocor both failing at sepsis kind of in the space of 3 or 4 months, and that put a huge chill on the sector. And I think that as on the VC side, Kevin and our job is to kind of not go with the crowd right now. So we got to kind of bet against the crowd if we're trying to get outsized returns. And I think that the thing that's going through my mind with this particular sector is, you can be the smartest person in the room, but if you're too early, it doesn't matter. If you're too late, it doesn't matter. So the question is, can you go against the grain and somehow be within that window where you're just not too early? I mean, quite frankly, if you were a venture investor in Organogenesis, that's a tough road. That was a tough road. That was too early. So I think one of the things we have to do also as an industry, convince Wall Street that it's not too early or it's not too late. But I think in the infancy of regenerative medicine, we're going to find, and I understand Unicure, but I think we're going to find negative events are going to negatively affect a lot of people, and positive events are going to affect a lot more people. I think Unicure wasn't a U.S. base, so people didn't pay that much attention to it. But I think once we see 3 or 4 straight good phase 3 results that are phase 3s that are run well. I saw some data this morning. Everything was open label. And, 10 patients and it was open label. And you say, well, how much stock should I really put in that trial? So I think, Remy, what you said, one of the things Wall Street has gotten better at is understanding the rigorousness of clinical trials and discounting some of the trials that take some shortcuts. So
I'm going to tell you that this slide, kind of depicts what I think is the mindset of the investor. And to me, based on a lot of the just sort of exuberance we're seeing in the marketplace, at least for some names, for example, Sarepta, with 10 patients worth of data, this is an exon skipping technology, has close to $1 billion, market cap on 10 patients worth of data, yet investors are staying, behind it. It wasn't just like a inflection point and has come back down. And so at least my call when I look at something like this is we're in the, thrill sort of phase, if not euphoria sort of phase in the public markets. This is excluding the smaller cap names, which lately have been turning down. Today the Dow is down about 250 points. Small caps have not been participating for the large part in the rally, but at least in the bigger names, I think we're in the thrill side of this equation. Do you guys, where do you guys think we are?
Take the words out of that chart, and on the x-axis put valuation, and on the y-axis, on the x-axis put time, and the y-axis put valuation. That's how the biotech industry trades.
Yeah.
Just take away the words. That's it.
Yeah. One of the things that I always try to think about is classic historical venture capital made their outsized returns by leveraging big cleverness with small capital, not by leveraging small cleverness with big capital. And if you think about that, as we try to do in making any investment, then you have a significant chance of success if you don't make a technical error or a scientific error. But you need to be very careful the amount of money you're putting behind something. So stay away from Me Too's, stay away from science projects that are going to exceed the life of your fund and consume more than your fund in capital. So I think if you do those correctly, you'll get the appropriate breaks in the technology and in the luck.
So before the panel kind of weighs in on where we might be in this phase, in the cell therapy space, we have about 5 minutes, and I'd love to open it up to the audience if there are any questions for our panel. Because if there's not, there's one question that I do have for them for the companies. But anyone? No one has financing issues. Oh, there you go. One person.
I don't have any finance.
Okay.
Robert Spezialy, I'd like you to comment on something that I think is fascinating. You were talking about biotech in the early 90s, but isn't there a different phenomenon here? I call it contamination, because you have a cottage industry of translational centers that have been doing this kind of work for years. How does that affect the vision that you have? They have all of these translational centers doing the 2,500 investigator-initiated INDs that we're putting out all the time against the commercial enterprise, trying to do the same thing.
Who wants to take
Kevin, I don't know. What do you think?
I think investigator-initiated INDs are great because they can make the rubber hit the road a lot faster than waiting for the laborious process of getting an official IND open with the FDA. So I think that's a good thing, and I think that the capabilities in translational medicine of a ton of universities really advanced the ball, up the field from the standpoint of screening, medicinal chemistry, cell culture, all of those things, so that when the handoff comes to a venture fund to say, okay, we've reached a point where now it's smart to inject capital, which is kind of where we got to with this company, and CASA out of Stanford that I mentioned. And it 10, 15, 20 years ago, that would not have been possible. It had still been a guessing game as to where things were. The investigator wouldn't have positive data in 3 animal species, proof of concept. So I love the translational medicine efforts that are going on in universities across the country and the world.
Yeah, and just because it's investigator-led doesn't mean that it's not controlled or you can't do multi-site.
Right.
So, for example, we're about to launch a study now in ALS, a clinical trial, which is essentially repurposing an existing drug. We found it using a stem cell-based model of disease, and then because we had this network, we can do 120 patients, multiple sites, and including a control arm.
So in the last couple of minutes, what advice would you give those in the audience for obtaining funding and moving their pipeline forward? Just kind of given where we are in the cycle, anything that you would impart on them that you think they should really be considering. I'll start with you, Kevin, and just go down the line.
Unfortunately, it's so case specific. It depends on the financing history, the capitalization structure, what the market is, what the reimbursement issues you may confront, where you are in terms of clinical trials. Unfortunately, the audience is, I am assuming, a mix of all of these things. So I just don't have a nostrum to dispense, to everyone.
Dan, do you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't have anything that's that overreaching. I would just say what we've done, which is to go after protein replacement, essentially. So it's fairly straightforward and fairly simple. We're not doing therapeutic proteins. We're not doing knockdowns. We're not doing some of the more complicated things that you can do in gene therapy. We're using what we think is one of the safer vectors, which is AAV. We do have, in all of our ophthalmology programs, we do have, FDA and EMA telling us what the guidelines are. We're getting a lot of information from them and help from them in designing trials. So we're trying to make it as simple as we can, or at least knock down as much risk as we can. I mean, if you stack the risk factors up there, and there's 5 or 10 or 15 of them, how many of those straw men can you knock down as fast as possible? Because there's a whole bunch that you really can't control for. So how do you move through that? And that's really what we've tried to do. I realize that's not possible for everybody's company, but that's been the path we've taken.
Dennis?
I think I'd use the word interdependence. I think that the days of acting in a silo, Kevin alluded to spending a ton of money creating the same mistake the person next to you created. is not going to advance the cause here. So I think that, you know, Brock talked a little bit before about disease foundations, patients. I think that for us to succeed in this sector, we really need to be interdependent. We've got to figure out how to not copy each other's mistakes, but learn from them. And we have to figure out how to use capital efficiently.
Brock?
To echo that theme, last couple of years we held a couple of workshops at the Harvard Business School where we had groups from disease foundations, academics, companies, and venture capitalists say, how do those four circles sort of, you know, what Venn diagram do they form in order, and it wasn't just in regenerative medicine space, but in order to accelerate drug and therapeutic discovery faster and more efficiently. So I really do think it is an issue of interdependence, as Dennis mentioned. And I think we need to figure out, you know, what does each of those circles do well, and then where are the commonalities, and how do we make that sort of economically work and share information in the process. And I think it'll also force us, each of those groups, to be more open than historically it has.
Just from a public perspective, I would say that the KISS method, the keep it simple, stupid method, really rings true, at least when we're analyzing companies. You know, we love looking at companies that are tackling monogenic, you know, disease indications. The more complicated it gets, where we don't understand the biology of the underlying disease, it makes it that much tougher for us to figure out, you know, how this therapeutic is going to tackle that. And so the more a company can make a focused message, at least in our point of view, it really helps in helping the investor focus as well. And with that, I'd like to thank the panel and thank the audience as well for your time and attention. Thank you.